The set was alive with movement, cameras rolling, lights shifting, whispers spreading through the crew. It was supposed to be just another day of filming, another scene, another take. But today, something was wrong. Sandra Bullock felt it the moment she stepped onto the set. The air was thick with tension, the kind that coils in your chest and doesn't let go. And at the center of it all, John Hargrove, a director known for his genius, but also for his brutal tactics. As the cameras rolled, the pressure mounted, the verbal jabs, the condescending remarks, the calculated humiliation in front of the crew. Then, just as John was ready to tear her down again, the door opened. Keanu Reeves had arrived, and with one look, he understood everything. Because today, the real battle wouldn't be in front of the cameras, it would be behind them. And by the time the day was over, someone was going to lose everything. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The set was alive with movement, an intricate dance of crew members adjusting lights, cameras rolling into place, and last-minute script checks. Sandra Bullock took a deep breath, standing in front of the mirror in her trailer. Today was going to be tough. She was no stranger to emotionally demanding scenes. She had built her career on them. But something about today felt heavier. Maybe it was the intensity of the scene. Or maybe it was the director, John Hargrove, a perfectionist, a visionary, and a man with no patience for imperfection. Stepping onto the set, Sandra could feel the tension thick in the air. The scene they were about to shoot was a pivotal moment in the film, one of deep pain and resilience, the kind of moment that would define the character. She knew exactly what needed to be done. The cameras were ready. The crew stood in position, waiting for John's cue. Then, action! Sandra dove into the scene, her voice raw, emotions spilling out in every word. The weight of the performance hung in the air as she delivered her final line. Then, silence, and finally John's voice. Cut. Sandra exhaled slowly, waiting for feedback. But instead of the usual adjustments or technical notes, John let out a low chuckle. It wasn't amusement, it was disappointment. Is that all you've got? The entire crew froze. John stood from his director's chair, pacing toward the set. Sandra turned to face him, her heart pounding. She had worked with tough directors before, but something about John's approach was always cutting, always designed to get under your skin. Let's try that again, he said, his voice sharper now, and this time, act like you care. Sandra's stomach twisted. She had been in the industry long enough to handle criticism, but there was something about the way John said it, loud enough for everyone to hear, dripping with condescension. She clenched her fists out of view of the camera. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She just had to focus. The cameras rolled again. Sandra delivered the scene with even more intensity, more control. She knew it was good. She could feel it. But as soon as the last word left her lips, John stood up again. And then, in a voice that carried across the entire set, "Wow, has our star finally lost her shine?" Laughter rippled through a few of the crew members. Most of them remained silent, eyes shifting uncomfortably. Sandra felt a sharp, familiar pain rise in her chest. It wasn't the insult itself. It was the way he said it. A challenge, a test, and the worst part? He wanted her to break. Sandra stood completely still, refusing to react. But deep down, something inside her cracked. She wasn't sure if it was anger or doubt. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just about one bad take. This was about respect. And as the silence stretched across the set, one thought pressed into her mind. Was she the only one who felt this way? The set remained eerily silent after John's comment. Sandra Bullock stood her ground, but inside, she could feel a slow burn of humiliation and frustration creeping in. She had been in the industry long enough to endure harsh directors, impossible expectations, and long, grueling days. But there was a difference between pushing an actor to their best and publicly tearing them down. And John Hargrove, he didn't seem to know the difference. Sandra exhaled slowly, forcing her expression to remain neutral. She wouldn't let him see that his words had hit their mark. But as she scanned the faces of the crew, she realized something. Everyone had heard it. Some of them had their heads down, eyes fixed on their work. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, and a few had smirks on their faces, crew members who had been around John long enough to know that this was normal. This was expected, because John Hargrove's reputation wasn't just about being a perfectionist, it was about being a bully, and no one stood up to him. Sandra clenched her jaw, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. She wasn't a rookie. She had worked with some of the greatest directors in the world. She had pushed herself through exhausting roles mentally and physically, but something about this moment, being torn down in front of an entire set like she was nothing, felt different. And worse, doubt began creeping in. Maybe she wasn't good enough anymore. Maybe John was right. Maybe she really had lost her shine. The thought made her stomach twist. She closed her eyes for a second, forcing the negativity away. No, she knew her talent. She knew her worth. And she wasn't about to let one man's arrogance take that away from her. John clapped his hands, breaking the silence. All right, people, let's go again. Maybe this time, our lead will actually show up. Sandra inhaled sharply but gave a small nod to the assistant director. She needed to get through this. Just finish the scene. Just prove him wrong. The cameras rolled. She threw herself back into the moment, letting the character's pain consume her. Her performance was stronger, deeper, real. She could feel it. And when she hit her final line, it was perfect. Or so she thought. John's voice cut through the moment like a knife. Cut! Sandra looked up, breathless, hopeful. But John just shook his head, a cold smirk on his face. Still missing something? Maybe you should watch some of your old movies, see if you can remember how to act. Laughter, not from everyone, but from enough people to make her chest tighten. She forced herself to stay still, to keep her breathing even. But inside, she was breaking. The room was filled with an unspoken question. Would anyone say anything? Would anyone challenge John? The crew exchanged glances. Some looked ashamed. Others looked relieved that they weren't the target. And then, John made his final blow. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Sandra, sweetheart, if the next take isn't better, I'll have to start thinking about a replacement. Understood? A cold chill ran down Sandra's spine. She knew he wasn't serious. She was the lead. The studio wanted her, but the message was clear. She was replaceable. And no one on set was going to fight for her. She was alone. Or at least, that's what she thought. Because at that moment, someone new arrived on set. And for the first time that day, the balance of power was about to shift. As Sandra tried to compose herself, the door to the set opened. She turned her head slightly, and that's when she saw him. Keanu Reeves. His presence was calm, but commanding. He took in the room quickly, silently. And from the slight furrow in his brow, it was clear. He could feel the tension immediately. And Sandra? She could already tell. John Hargrove had no idea what was coming next. The tension on set was so thick, it could have choked the air. Sandra kept her head down, her fists clenched by her sides, fighting against the humiliation burning in her chest. John Hargrove sat in his director's chair, satisfied, watching the crew scramble to reset the scene. He had made his point. He was in charge. No one would dare challenge him. But as the door to the soundstage swung open, the power dynamic in the room shifted. Because standing in the entrance, quietly observing, was Keanu Reeves. Keanu took a slow step forward, his gaze scanning the room. He had seen a lot of film sets in his time. He had worked with demanding directors, faced intense pressure, and had his fair share of difficult shoots. But this was something else. The energy in the room felt off, like everyone was walking on thin ice, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the space the moment John had opened his mouth. And the way Sandra was standing, stiff, unreadable, but holding something back, told him everything he needed to know. Something had happened. Something was wrong. John finally noticed Keanu's presence. His smug expression flickered just for a second. Because Keanu wasn't just an actor. He was Keanu Reeves, an industry veteran respected by everyone, including people who didn't even work in film. John forced a casual smirk, standing up from his chair. Well, the legend himself. Keanu's expression didn't change. Hey, John. His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge beneath it. John gestured toward Sandra. You're just in time to see your co-star in action, or trying at least. A few crew members stiffened. Sandra didn't react, but Keanu? His eyes narrowed just slightly. A flicker of something dangerous crossed his face, the kind of look that made people rethink their words before saying them. John didn't notice, or worse, he didn't care. He clapped his hands, addressing the crew. "All right, let's reset. I want to better take this time." Then looking at Sandra with mock encouragement, "Unless you think you need a break?" It was a challenge, a dare, and before Sandra could answer, Keanu spoke. "How about we take a minute?" The set went silent. John turned his head, his smirk faltering slightly. "Excuse me?" Keanu's gaze stayed locked on him. "A break. You've been running this scene back to back. I think we could all use one." John let out a small, amused laugh. "We don't have time for that. We're already behind schedule." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "So maybe pushing people to the breaking point isn't the best strategy." A few crew members exchanged glances. It wasn't a loud statement. It wasn't a direct attack. But it was enough. A crack in John's undisputed authority. John's smile tightened. "I appreciate the concern, but I know how to run my set." Keanu didn't blink. "Yeah?" A beat. Then with perfectly calm delivery, "Because from what I'm seeing, it looks more like you're running people into the ground." The entire crew froze. Sandra's breath caught. Keanu wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing. But there was power in the way he spoke, a controlled defiance. And for the first time, John Hargrove looked unsettled. John forced a laugh, but his body was tense. He wasn't used to being questioned, not in front of his entire crew. And now Keanu Reeves was standing between him and his authority. And the question that hung in the air was clear. Was John really going to challenge him? Or was he about to lose control of his own set? The set was frozen, every crew member holding their breath as Keanu Reeves and John Hargrove locked eyes. No one had ever openly challenged John in front of his own team before. And now, Keanu had just done it with calm precision, no yelling, no theatrics, just truth. And John didn't like it, not one bit. John forced a tight smile, the tension in his jaw barely concealed. "I appreciate the concern, Keanu." His voice was calculated, the way a man speaks when he's trying to keep control. "But let's be clear, I run this set, not you." Keanu didn't blink. "Then start acting like it." A wave of shock passed through the crew. Even Sandra's breath caught. John's expression darkened. "Excuse me." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "You think breaking people down makes them perform better?" His tone was steady, unshaken. "All I see is a set full of people afraid to breathe wrong in front of you." John's face twitched. "Do you have any idea how many films I've directed?" Keanu nodded. "And how many people walked away from them hating the process?" That one hit. John stiffened, and for the first time he had no response. The silence stretched, and then Sandra took a step forward. Her voice was calm but strong. "Keanu's right." John turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Sandra," but she didn't stop. "This set isn't just about the movie. It's about the people making it." She looked around the room. The crew, the cast, the people who had been watching this unfold in silence. "We all love this project, but that doesn't mean we should be treated like we're replaceable." A few people nodded subtly. Others shifted uncomfortably, because the truth was, they all agreed. They had just been too scared to say it, until now. John let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You two are unbelievable. You think you can just waltz in here and tell me how to do my job?" He turned, raising his voice now. "Anyone who has a problem with my methods is free to walk." Silence. But this time, it wasn't fearful silence. It was the kind of silence that felt like a turning point. Sandra met Keanu's gaze, and then she turned back to John. "Then I'll go first." Gasps rippled through the crew. John's face drained of color. "Sandra, don't be ridiculous." She stepped back. "No movie is worth my dignity, and no director is worth my respect if they don't give it back." She turned to the crew. "Anyone else?" A beat, then a sound no one expected. The assistant director set down his clipboard. A camera operator stepped away from the rig. The script supervisor crossed her arms and nodded. One by one, people started making a choice that John never thought they'd make. John's control was slipping. And now, for the first time, he wasn't the one giving orders. The question was, would he let this moment destroy his career? Or would he finally realize he wasn't untouchable anymore? The sound of footsteps echoed across the set as crew members slowly began stepping away from their stations. John Hargrove sat frozen in disbelief, watching the shift unfold before his eyes. He had ruled over so many productions, believing that fear and control were the best ways to command respect. But now, his own team was walking away from him. And worst of all, it was Keanu and Sandra who had started it. Not everyone moved. Some of the crew members stayed firmly in place, uncertain, unwilling to risk their jobs. Others exchanged looks, silent agreements, shared resentment bubbling to the surface. For years, they had endured John's verbal lashings, his humiliating methods, his cruelty disguised as perfectionism. But now, they saw a choice. And that choice was simple: stand with John or stand for respect. The first real voice of defiance came from one of the lighting techs, a man named Eric, who had worked on dozens of sets before this one. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never worked under someone who made me dread showing up to set every day. Until now." John's eyes flashed with anger. "Excuse me?" But Eric didn't stop. "You push people to the edge and call it great directing. But all you do is break them down." A few others murmured in agreement. Keanu and Sandra remained quiet, watching as the crew found their own voices. The assistant director, a woman named Lena, crossed her arms. "I've been trying to tell you for months, John. Your way doesn't work anymore, and now you're finally seeing why." John let out a harsh laugh, trying to mask the cracks in his control. "So this is it? A rebellion? You all think you can just, run this movie without me?" No one answered, and that silence was louder than any argument. Sandra took a step forward, her voice steady. "No one is saying the movie doesn't need a director, John." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "We're just saying it doesn't need you." A beat. John stared at her, his face unreadable. But deep down he knew he had pushed too far, and for the first time in his career, he was losing. Sandra squared her shoulders. "I meant what I said. If things don't change, I'm out." John's jaw clenched. "You're under contract." Keanu finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "And so is the studio, which means they have just as much say in what happens next as you do." And that was the moment John realized he wasn't in control anymore, because he wasn't the only one with power in this situation. And now, the decision wasn't his alone. It belonged to the studio, the producers, the people who had just watched their lead actress and key crew members threaten to walk. And when John looked around at the faces staring back at him, he finally saw it. He was alone. A silence settled over the set as a production assistant hurried away, no doubt running to inform the executives about what had just happened. John's hands curled into fists, because for the first time in his career, his fate was no longer in his own hands. And the next meeting would determine whether he even had a career left at all. The studio conference room was colder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way because of the tension hanging in the air. Sandra sat at the long table, her arms crossed, her expression steady but unreadable. Keanu sat beside her, calm and unwavering as always, his presence a quiet but undeniable force. Across from them, John Hargrove. He wasn't smiling anymore. The lead producer, Mark Levinson, adjusted his glasses as he flipped through a few papers. He had already been briefed on what happened on set, and now he was about to decide John's fate. "Let's cut to the point," Mark finally said, his voice sharp and professional. "We have an issue, and it's not just about delays. It's about workplace treatment, about how this production is being run." John let out a dry chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, come on, Mark. Are we really doing this? I push my actors to get the best performance possible. It's what I do. It's what I've always done." Sandra's expression didn't change. Keanu, however, tilted his head slightly. his sharp eyes never leaving John. Mark didn't buy the excuse. "That's not what this is about, John." He tapped his fingers against the table, looking directly at him. "The problem isn't your methods. It's your complete lack of respect for the people you work with." A few executives nodded subtly. And John? For the first time, he looked nervous. Lena, the assistant director, spoke next. "John, you don't just push people, you belittle them. You humiliate them in front of the entire crew. And for what? To feel powerful?" John's jaw tightened. "Oh, please. Sandra's a professional. She knows how the industry works." Sandra finally spoke, her voice calm but direct. "I do. And I also know the difference between a tough director and a toxic one." John rolled his eyes. "Oh, give me a break." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his tone controlled but firm. "She's not the only one, John." John went quiet, because he knew what Keanu meant. This wasn't just about Sandra. This was about the entire crew finally speaking up. And now? The studio was listening. Mark sighed, setting his papers down. "Here's where we stand, John. This production cannot move forward in a hostile work environment, period. The studio has invested too much in this film to let it crumble over power struggles." John stiffened. "Meaning?" Mark exchanged a glance with the other executives before delivering the final blow. "Meaning if you don't change, we replace you." The words landed hard. For the first time, John looked genuinely rattled. "You can't be serious." Mark didn't blink. "Try me." Silence. Tense. Unbreakable. Sandra and Keanu watched as John processed the reality in front of him. He could fight this and risk losing his position entirely, or he could swallow his pride. John looked around the table, eyes flicking from Mark to the other executives, then to Sandra, then finally to Keanu. And the way Keanu stared back at him, cool, unwavering, unreadable, made something in him crack. John exhaled slowly, looking down at the table. Then, "What exactly do you want me to do?" Sandra raised an eyebrow. Keanu didn't move. And Mark? He smiled slightly. Because John had just admitted defeat. But whether he would truly change, that was a question no one could answer yet. John Hargrove sat silent in his chair. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. The studio had spoken. The cast and crew had stood up to him. And now, he had two choices, change or walk away. And John Hargrove, he wasn't ready to be replaced. During a break, Keanu and Sandra stood near the monitors, watching a playback of the last scene. Sandra sighed. "Do you think he'll keep this up?" Keanu took a sip of his coffee, thinking. People don't change overnight. He turned to her, his eyes calm, knowing. But sometimes they change just enough. Sandra smiled, the weight of the past few days finally lifting. And for the first time since this film started, she actually felt good about being here. As the cameras rolled again, Sandra delivered her best performance yet. The entire crew watched, entranced. Even John from behind the monitor nodded subtly. But the real question lingered in the air. Would this new version of John last? Or was this just another performance? Only time would tell. The set was different now. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't suddenly a dream workplace, but it was better, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, the energy on set shifted. John Hargrove, though still strict and demanding, had learned to control his temper. He gave constructive criticism, not humiliation. He pushed his actors, but no longer at the cost of their dignity. And Sandra? For the first time in a long time, she actually enjoyed her work again. One evening after filming wrapped, Sandra was packing up her things when she heard a familiar voice. "You were incredible today." She turned to see John standing there, hands in his pockets. She studied him carefully. "Thanks." John hesitated before speaking again. "I meant what I said before. I pushed too hard, and I almost lost everything because of it." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Almost?" John smirked slightly. "Let's just say I got lucky." He glanced at the set, where crew members were laughing, talking, relaxed in a way they never had been before. "If Keanu hadn't called me out, if you hadn't stood your ground, I don't think I'd be standing here right now." Sandra crossed her arms. "So what now? Is this the new John Hargrove?" He sighed. "I don't know, but I'm trying." She nodded slowly. "That's all anyone can ask for." A few days later, Sandra sat in her trailer, flipping through her next potential script. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Keanu stepped inside, a familiar, knowing smile on his face. "Got a minute?" She motioned for him to sit, already sensing something was up. He slid a folder across the table. She picked it up, flipping through the first few pages. Her eyebrows lifted. "A new project?" Keanu nodded. "I read the script. It's good, and they want both of us." Sandra smirked. "Another drama? Or something lighter this time?" Keanu chuckled. "A little of both." She leaned back, tapping her fingers against the folder. "And the director?" Keanu grinned knowingly. "Let's just say we get to pick this time." Sandra laughed, shaking her head. For the first time in a long time, she felt in control of her choices, of her career, of her future. And as she looked down at the script, she knew one thing. Whatever came next, she wasn't walking into it alone.